A quantum computer just plugged into a normal wall outlet, sat inside a regular server rack, and started running code at room temperature with no giant refrigerator, no vacuum chamber, and no near absolute zero cooling system anywhere in sight. For years, every serious quantum computer on Earth needed to be cooled down colder than outer space just to function. Now, a small German startup says they've cracked that problem wide open. And the secret ingredient sitting at the heart of their machine is something you can literally buy at a jewelry store: diamonds. This isn't a thought experiment or a distant theoretical proposal buried in an academic paper. This is a working physical quantum computer sitting in a lab right now, built by a company called Saxon Q, and it represents mainstream quantum computing that the field has seen in years. To understand why this matters so much, we need to back up and talk about the single biggest obstacle that has held quantum computers back from becoming everyday tools, rather than multi-million-dollar science experiments locked away in specialized facilities. Quantum computers are powerful because they exploit strange properties of physics that don't exist in the world we experience every day. Instead of representing information as simple ones and zeros, the way every normal computer does, quantum computers use qubits, which can exist in a strange in-between state called superposition, representing multiple possibilities at once. This property, combined with another strange quantum phenomenon called entanglement, theoretical power to solve certain types of problems dramatically faster than any traditional computer ever could. But here's the catch that has haunted this entire field since the very beginning. Qubits are almost unbelievably fragile. The tiniest disturbance, a stray vibration, a flicker of heat, a random electromagnetic field passing nearby, can instantly destroy the delicate quantum state a qubit is holding. Physicists call this problem decoherence, and it is, without exaggeration, the single biggest technical challenge standing between today's quantum computers and tomorrow's fully useful ones. Most of the leading quantum computing approaches developed over the past 2 decades have dealt with this fragility problem the same way. They isolate their qubits as completely as possible from the outside world, and they cool everything down to temperatures just a hair above absolute zero, colder than the vacuum of deep space itself. Superconducting qubits, the technology used by companies like IBM and Google in their most famous quantum computers, require massive, elaborate refrigeration systems called dilution refrigerators. These machines are enormous, expensive, delicate, and require constant expert monitoring. Just getting one of these systems down to operating temperature can take days. This is exactly the problem that has kept quantum computing largely confined to specialized research labs and a handful of well-funded tech giants. If you need a room-sized refrigerator running at a fraction of a degree above absolute zero just to run a single quantum calculation, you're not exactly building something that fits into a normal office, let alone something a hospital, a small research team, or an autonomous vehicle could realistically use. Now let's talk about diamonds and why this particular material turned out to hold a genuinely clever way around this entire cooling problem. Back in the 1970s, scientists noticed something strange about certain diamonds. Under specific lighting conditions, these diamonds glowed with a brilliant red light that shouldn't have been there in a perfectly pure crystal. Eventually, researchers figured out what was happening. Occasionally, during a diamond's formation, a single nitrogen atom ends up sitting exactly where a carbon atom should be inside the crystal's otherwise perfectly ordered structure. Right next to that misplaced nitrogen atom sits an empty gap, a missing carbon atom entirely, called a vacancy. Together, this pairing of a nitrogen atom next to an empty vacancy is known as a nitrogen-vacancy center, or NV center for short. Here's where things get genuinely fascinating from a physics standpoint. That lone nitrogen atom sitting right beside its empty. Neighboring vacancy behaves almost like a single trapped atom, isolated and protected inside the surrounding lattice of carbon atoms that make up the diamond. And crucially, the electron sitting at that spot can spin independently of all the electrons in the surrounding carbon structure. That electron spin is exactly the property scientists need to build a functioning qubit. Scientists can manipulate this trapped electron spin using carefully aimed lasers, setting it into a specific starting state that researchers label as zero. From there, precisely tuned microwave pulses can nudge that electron into a whole range of different configurations, including genuine quantum superposition states that a simple everyday binary bit could never represent. In other words, this single flawed atom sitting inside an otherwise pristine diamond can function as a real, working qubit. What makes this approach so different from superconducting qubits is the protection built directly into the diamond's own structure. The carbon atoms surrounding that nitrogen vacancy pair form an incredibly strong, tightly bonded crystal lattice. That dense cage of carbon atoms naturally shields the fragile quantum state from a lot of the outside disturbances that would otherwise wreck it. It's a bit like the diamond itself is doing part of the refrigeration job just by being an exceptionally strong, exceptionally pure physical structure. This is exactly why nitrogen-vacancy qubits have shown real promise for operating without extreme cryogenic cooling, something almost no other major quantum computing approach can claim. Now, this concept of using diamond defects as qubits isn't actually brand new. Researchers at Harvard demonstrated early versions of diamond-based quantum memory well over a decade ago, and physicists have been steadily chipping away at this technology ever since. But here's the problem that has held this particular approach back for years. While individual nitrogen vacancy, qubits worked beautifully in isolated lab demonstrations. Nobody had managed to reliably scale this technology up past around 10 qubits. Creating these nitrogen vacancy defects with enough precision and consistency to build a larger, genuinely useful system proved to be an extraordinarily difficult manufacturing challenge. This is exactly the wall that Saxon Q, a startup founded by researchers, including Leipzig University physics professor Marius Grundmann, claims to have finally broken through. Their breakthrough came down to a clever materials science trick. When the Saxon Q team creates these nitrogen vacancy centers inside their lab-grown diamonds, they don't just implant nitrogen atoms on their own. They also co-implant sulfur atoms alongside the nitrogen. According to Grundmann, this is the key technical insight that unlocked everything else. The sulfur shifts the local chemical environment in a way that leaves the vacancy negatively charged, and the sulfur atom effectively donates an extra electron to make that happen. This same process also dramatically increases the yield of successfully formed nitrogen vacancy pairs, meaning far more of the intended defects actually form correctly and reliably during manufacturing. That single manufacturing improvement mattered enormously, because reliability at scale is exactly what had been missing from this technology for years. Suddenly, instead of being stuck below 10 functional qubits, the Saxon Q team could reliably produce systems with far more qubits working together consistently. The results they're reporting are genuinely impressive by industry standards. Saxon Q says their qubits achieve a 99.92% fidelity rate before any error correction is even applied, meaning fewer than one error occurs for every 1,000 quantum operations performed. According to Grundmann, more recent internal testing pushed that number even higher, up to 99.98% fidelity for single qubit operations. For context, that level of accuracy is genuinely comparable to fidelity numbers reported by some of the most advanced superconducting quantum computing systems in the world, including systems built by industry giants like IBM. Let's talk about the actual hardware itself, because the practical, real-world design here is arguably just as important as the underlying physics. The current Saxon Q system fits inside a completely standard server rack, the same kind of equipment rack you'd find in any conventional data center. It plugs directly into a normal alternating current power outlet, the exact same kind of outlet powering your refrigerator, your television, or your laptop charger at home. There's no need for specialized cryogenic plumbing, no massive dilution refrigerator, no team of engineers babysitting a delicate cooling system around the clock. You essentially wheel it in, plug it in, and it's ready to run quantum calculations. The company's currently available hardware supports configurations reaching up to 128 qubits, and Saxon Q says a 512 qubit version is planned for delivery within the next year. Looking further ahead, the company's long-term roadmap aims to scale beyond 10,000 qubits sometime after 2030. Those are ambitious targets, and it's worth treating any of skepticism, since the entire quantum computing industry has a long history of ambitious projections that ended up taking considerably longer to achieve than originally announced. Still, even the currently working 128 qubit system represents a genuine milestone for this particular diamond-based approach to quantum computing. By the way, if deep dives into breakthroughs like this one are exactly the kind of content you're here for, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so the next one lands right in your feed. Let's talk honestly about how this diamond-based approach actually stacks up against the other major quantum computing technologies currently competing for dominance in this rapidly evolving field. Because the comparison is genuinely nuanced. Superconducting qubits, the approach used by companies like IBM and Google, currently tend to operate faster than diamond-based nitrogen vacancy systems for many types of calculations. That raw speed advantage remains a real and meaningful edge for superconducting technology, at least for now. But that speed comes bundled with the massive cooling infrastructure requirement we talked about earlier, along with all of the expense, complexity, and physical footprint that comes attached to it. Trapped ion quantum computers represent another major competing approach, using individual charged atoms suspended and controlled with precise electromagnetic fields. These systems tend to offer excellent qubit stability and impressively low error rates, but they also generally require significant cooling and extremely sophisticated laser control. Systems, along with real challenges when it comes to scaling up to large numbers of qubits quickly. Photonic quantum computers, which use particles of light instead of trapped particles or superconducting circuits, offer yet another approach with some natural advantages when it comes to resisting certain types of environmental noise, but getting individual photons to reliably interact with each other in a controlled way has proven to be its own persistent engineering headache for that particular branch of the field. Diamond-based nitrogen vacancy systems, the approach Saxon Q is building on, offer a genuinely distinct set of trade-offs compared to all of these alternatives. You give up some raw processing speed compared to the fastest superconducting systems currently available. But in exchange, you gain something that arguably matters just as much for real-world deployment, dramatically simpler infrastructure requirements, and the ability to run a genuine quantum computer without needing a specialized facility built specifically to support it. This trade-off opens up some genuinely interesting practical possibilities that the more traditional, heavily cooled quantum computing approaches simply can't offer. Grundmann has specifically pointed to edge computing scenarios as a promising near-term application, situations like autonomous vehicles or advanced robotic systems, where you might need quantum-level processing without relying on a slow round-trip connection to a distant cloud server. In situations where even a small amount of network latency could be genuinely dangerous, like a self-driving car making a split-second decision, having a compact, room-temperature quantum system physically on board becomes a meaningfully different proposition than needing to reach out to a quantum computer sitting in a specialized facility somewhere else entirely. Of course, it's important to stay appropriately grounded here and not get swept away by the excitement, because there are real, unresolved challenges still standing between this current technology and truly mainstream large-scale quantum computing. The most significant current bottleneck involves the physical chips themselves. Right now, Saxon Q's individual chips are limited to supporting either 8 or 16 qubits each. Reaching that current maximum of 128 qubits means combining multiple smaller chips together into a single working system. Scaling up toward the company's more ambitious future targets, systems supporting hundreds of thousands or even millions of qubits, will require figuring out how to pack dramatically larger numbers of these nitrogen-vacancy qubits onto individual chips, a genuinely difficult manufacturing and engineering challenge that remains largely unsolved at this point in time. There's also an important note of caution worth mentioning about independent verification. While Live Science reported reviewing a detailed technical white paper explaining exactly how Saxon Q's system works, there doesn't appear to be any independently published, peer-reviewed research demonstrating a functional nitrogen-vacancy quantum computer operating with more than 10 qubits before this particular launch. That means, at least for now, the specific performance claims coming from Saxon Q haven't yet been independently verified by outside research teams working with the same hardware. That's a completely normal and expected part of how new technology typically gets introduced to the world, but it's worth being clear and upfront about, rather than simply taking every impressive-sounding number completely at face value without appropriate scrutiny. It's also genuinely difficult at this early stage to make a truly fair apples-to-apples comparison between Saxon Q's diamond-based systems and the far more established quantum computing platforms that companies like IBM and Google have already spent well over a decade developing and refining. Most of the previous research specifically focused on nitrogen vacancy centers has actually concentrated on quantum sensing applications rather than full-scale quantum computing, things like ultra-precise magnetic field detection or advanced medical imaging techniques, rather than running complex quantum computing algorithms. Successfully repurposing this same underlying diamond technology, specifically for general-purpose quantum computation, at meaningful qubit counts represents a genuinely new and still relatively unproven direction for the field. Let's take a step back now and think about why this particular breakthrough matters so much for the future of the broader quantum computing industry as a whole, beyond just this one specific company and their specific machine. For years, one of the biggest criticisms leveled at quantum computing as an entire field has been the enormous gap between its long-term theoretical promise and its current practical accessibility. Building and maintaining a working quantum computer has typically required not just a massive financial investment, but also a specialized facility, a team of highly trained engineers, and an enormous amount of ongoing operational overhead. That reality has effectively locked quantum computing research inside the walls of major tech companies, elite research universities, and a small handful of well-funded government laboratories around the world. A room-temperature quantum computer that can simply plug into a standard wall outlet and slide into a normal server rack represents a genuinely different kind of accessibility. It doesn't automatically mean quantum computers are suddenly cheap or trivial to build and operate. They certainly aren't yet, and likely won't be for quite some time. but it does meaningfully lower some of the most significant infrastructure barriers that have kept quantum computing locked away from smaller research teams, individual universities, and companies without billions of dollars in available research funding to spend. If diamond-based nitrogen vacancy systems continue improving and successfully scale toward the thousands or eventually millions of qubits companies like Saxon Q are targeting on their roadmaps, we could eventually see quantum computing hardware becoming something considerably closer to a specialized but genuinely accessible piece of standard computing equipment, rather than an exotic, room-sized science experiment that only a handful of organizations on the entire planet can realistically afford to build and maintain. It's worth remembering that this same basic pattern has played out before, more than once, across the broader history of computing technology. The earliest electronic computers filled entire rooms, required teams of specialized technicians just to keep them running reliably, and were accessible to only a tiny handful of government agencies, universities, and major corporations. Over the following decades, steady advances in materials, science, and manufacturing techniques gradually shrank those room-sized machines down into the personal computers, laptops, and smartphones that billions of people now carry around casually in their pockets every single day. Quantum computing is still extremely early in that same broad kind of technological journey, arguably somewhere around where classical computing sat back in the 1950s or 1960s. But breakthroughs like this diamond-based room temperature approach represent exactly the kind of meaningful infrastructure simplification that historically tends to precede much wider, more mainstream technological adoption down the road. There's also something almost poetic about the specific material driving this particular breakthrough. Diamonds have fascinated humans for thousands of years, prized throughout history purely for their beauty, their rarity, and their remarkable physical hardness. Now this exact same material, or more precisely, a deliberately imperfect version of it, engineered with microscopic atomic flaws, may end up playing a foundational role in one of the most important computing revolutions of the 21st century. The tiny defect that once seemed like nothing more than a strange optical quirk causing an unusual red glow back in the 1970s has turned out to be sitting on top of one of the most promising practical pathways toward genuinely accessible quantum computing that the field has ever discovered. Let's dig a little deeper into exactly how scientists actually control these trapped nitrogen atoms, because the process itself is a genuinely elegant piece of applied physics, even if it sounds almost deceptively simple when you first hear it described. The whole process starts with light. Researchers shine a carefully tuned green laser directly onto the diamond, targeting the exact locations where these nitrogen vacancy centers sit inside the crystal. That laser light interacts with the trapped electron sitting at the vacancy, pushing it into a specific, well-defined starting state that researchers label as zero. This step is often called optical initialization, and it's essentially the quantum equivalent of resetting a normal computer bit back to a known starting value before you begin a calculation. Once that electron has been set into its known zero state, researchers switch over to microwave pulses to actually manipulate it. By precisely tuning the frequency, timing, and duration of these microwave pulses, physicists can nudge the trapped electrons' configurations, including genuine superposition states that blend 0 and 1 together simultaneously, the exact property that gives quantum computers their unusual computational power in the first place. This step is roughly equivalent to performing a logical operation on a normal computer bit, except here, the operation is happening on a genuine quantum state rather than a simple binary switch. Finally, to actually read out the result of a calculation, researchers shine the laser back onto the diamond one more time. Depending on exactly what quantum state the trapped electron ended up in, the diamond emits red fluorescent light with a measurably different intensity. By carefully measuring that emitted light, researchers can determine the final state of the qubit, effectively reading out the answer to whatever calculation was just performed. This entire process, initialize with a laser, manipulate with microwaves, then read out with a laser again, forms the basic operational cycle that diamond-based nitrogen vacancy quantum computers rely on to actually perform useful work. What's remarkable about this entire approach is that every single step happens using nothing more exotic than lasers and microwave pulses, tools that are already extremely well understood and widely used across many other areas of physics and engineering. Compare that to superconducting quantum computers, which require exotic materials cooled to temperatures where electrical resistance essentially disappears entirely, and you start to understand why this diamond-based approach has such appealing practical advantages, even if it currently trades away some raw processing speed in the process. It's also worth spending a moment talking about why diamond specifically, rather than some other crystal, turned out to be such a good host material for this particular kind of quantum trick. Diamond is built from carbon atoms bonded together in an extraordinarily strong, rigid, tetrahedral lattice structure, the same fundamental bonding pattern that makes diamond the hardest, naturally occurring material known on Earth. That same structural rigidity that makes diamonds so famously scratch-resistant also happens to make an excellent shield for a fragile quantum state sitting at its center. The tightly packed carbon lattice surrounding a nitrogen-vacancy center helps insulate that trapped electron from a lot of the environmental noise, vibration, and electromagnetic interference that would otherwise disrupt a quantum state almost instantly. Diamond also has exceptionally low natural background noise at the atomic level compared to many other candidate materials, particularly when engineers use extremely pure, laboratory-grown synthetic diamonds rather than naturally occurring ones. Natural diamonds, the kind found in jewelry, contain all sorts of random impurities and structural defects scattered throughout their crystal structure in unpredictable locations. Laboratory-grown synthetic diamonds, by contrast, can be manufactured with an extraordinarily high degree of purity, allowing scientists to precisely control exactly where nitrogen vacancy centers form, rather than simply hoping nature happened to place a usable defect somewhere convenient. This exact level of manufacturing control turns out to be absolutely critical for scaling this technology up beyond just a handful of isolated qubits toward the kind of larger, genuinely useful systems companies like Saxon Q are now targeting. It's worth mentioning that Saxon Q isn't the only organization pursuing diamond-based quantum technology, even though their recent breakthrough has generated an unusual amount of attention. A European research consortium called Spinus, backed by roughly 10 million euros in funding from the European Commission and supported by the broader Quantum Flagship Initiative, has been pursuing a closely related approach, using diamonds alongside another materia temperature quantum simulators. Their stated goal involves tackling extremely complex physics problems, the kind of calculations that could eventually help accelerate the development of new pharmaceutical drugs or improve sophisticated financial optimization. Algorithms. The existence of multiple serious, well-funded research efforts all converging on the same general diamond-based approach, rather than just one isolated startup chasing an unusual idea, is itself a meaningful signal that the broader physics community sees genuine long-term promise in this particular direction. There's also a fascinating historical thread running through this entire story that's worth pausing on for a moment. Quantum computing itself, as a formal concept, traces back to physicist Richard Feynman first proposing the basic idea back in 1982. In the decades since then, researchers have explored an enormous range of different physical systems as potential candidates for building working qubits, everything from trapped individual atoms and semiconducting quantum dots to superconducting circuits and photonic systems built from particles of light. For most of that history, nearly every serious candidate technology shared one common, frustrating limitation. They all required extremely low temperatures to function reliably. Diamond-based nitrogen vacancy systems have stood out from that broader pack for years, specifically because of their unusual, genuine potential to operate effectively at normal room temperature. But turning that theoretical potential into an actual scaled working system has remained a stubborn engineering challenge for decades, right up until this recent breakthrough. Let's also talk a bit more about error correction, because it's a critical piece of the puzzle that often gets glossed over in more surface-level coverage of quantum computing news. Even with an impressively high fidelity rate, like the 99.98% figure Saxon Q has, quantum computers still need robust error correction systems layered on top of their raw hardware performance in order to run longer, more complex calculations reliably. Here's why that's true. Even a small, seemingly insignificant error rate compounds dramatically. Once you start chaining together thousands or even millions of individual quantum operations in sequence, the kind of complex calculation a genuinely useful quantum computer would eventually need to perform. A tiny error rate that seems perfectly acceptable for a single isolated operation can snowball into a completely unreliable garbage result once you're running a sufficiently long and complex quantum program. This is exactly why every serious quantum computing platform, including Saxon Q's diamond-based system, needs sophisticated error correction techniques working alongside the raw hardware itself. These techniques typically involve cleverly encoding a single piece of logical quantum information redundantly across multiple physical qubits, allowing the system to detect and automatically correct certain types of errors as they occur without needing to directly measure and thereby destroy the fragile quantum state itself. Saxon Q's reported fidelity numbers specifically describe performance before this additional layer of error correction gets applied, meaning the real-world reliability of longer, more complex calculations run on their system will ultimately depend heavily on exactly how well their specific error correction approach performs once it's fully implemented and rigorously tested at scale. Now, let's talk a bit more broadly about what kinds of problems a mature, fully scaled quantum computer, diamond-based or otherwise, could eventually help solve. Because understanding the destination helps clarify exactly why this particular infrastructure breakthrough matters so much in the first place. Quantum computers are especially well suited to a specific category of extremely complex problems that classical computers genuinely struggle with, problems involving searching through an enormous number of possible combinations or accurately simulating complex quantum mechanical systems. Drug discovery is frequently cited as one of the most promising potential applications, since quantum computers could eventually help candidate drug molecules interact with proteins inside the human body at a genuinely fundamental atomic level, a task that remains extraordinarily difficult and computationally expensive for classical computers to accurately model today. Materials science represents another genuinely promising frontier for quantum computing. Scientists could eventually use sufficiently powerful quantum computers to simulate and design entirely new materials, with precisely customized properties, potentially accelerating the development of dramatically better batteries, more efficient solar panels, or even other advanced quantum computing components themselves, creating an intriguing kind of self-reinforcing technological feedback loop. Financial modeling and complex logistics optimization represent yet another compelling application area, particularly for solving the kind of complicated optimization problems that show up constantly in fields like investment portfolio management, global supply chain logistics, and large-scale transportation network planning. These are exactly the kinds of problems where a genuinely capable quantum computer could eventually deliver dramatic, measurable, real-world advantages over even the most powerful classical supercomputers currently available anywhere on Earth. Of course, actually reaching the kind of large-scale, highly reliable quantum computer capable of tackling these ambitious real-world problems will require far more progress than just this one infrastructure breakthrough alone, no matter how genuinely significant it turns out to be. But removing the extreme cooling requirement that has defined quantum computing hardware for its entire history so far represents exactly the kind of foundational practical step that could meaningfully accelerate the field's overall progress toward those much bigger, far more ambitious long-term goals. So where does this story realistically go from here? Saxon Q plans to deliver its more powerful 512 qubit systems within the coming year, and the broader physics and quantum computing research community will undoubtedly be watching closely to see whether those specific performance numbers hold up as the technology continues scaling toward larger and larger systems. Independent research groups will likely want to get their hands on this hardware directly, to run their own tests and verify these claims for themselves, exactly the kind of independent verification process that any genuinely significant new technology needs to go through before the wider scientific community fully accepts it as reliable and reproducible. If this particular technology does continue to scale successfully the way the company's roadmap currently suggests, we could be looking at one of the most practical and genuinely accessible pathways toward mainstream quantum computing that has emerged in years. Not necessarily the fastest quantum computing approach available, and not necessarily the very first to reach 1 million functioning qubits, but quite possibly one of the very first quantum computing approaches, simple and practical enough to eventually show up in an ordinary data center, an ordinary research lab, or perhaps even an ordinary vehicle, without requiring a dedicated cryogenics team standing by around the clock just to keep the whole system running. If this kind of story, real physics, quietly reshaping what future technology could actually look like, is something you want to keep seeing, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive the moment it comes out. There's a genuinely wild amount of progress happening across the quantum computing field right now, and a surprising amount of it traces back to materials nobody expected to matter this much, sitting quietly in labs most people have simply never heard of. At the end of the day, the core story here is refreshingly simple to state, even if the underlying physics required to make it work is anything but simple. Scientists took one of the most familiar, most ancient materials known to humanity and found a way to trap individual atoms inside deliberately engineered flaws within its crystal structure, atoms that can hold and manipulate genuine quantum information without needing to be cooled anywhere near absolute zero. If this diamond-based approach keeps scaling the way its creators are hoping it will, we may eventually look back on this specific breakthrough as the moment quantum computing finally started to escape the specialized laboratory and step meaningfully closer toward the ordinary, everyday world the rest of us actually live in. And maybe that's the part of this story worth sitting with the longest. A flaw, a tiny imperfection that once seemed like nothing more than an odd optical curiosity inside a piece of jewelry, turned out to be the key that finally let quantum computing step out of a cryogenics lab and into a normal server room. Sometimes, the biggest technological leaps forward don't come from inventing something entirely new from scratch. They come from finally understanding, and finally learning how to precisely control something that was quietly sitting right in front of us the entire time.